you're all refreshed and enjoying your Sunday sessions here at the Cosmic Summit. Next up, we have an excellent speaker and another researcher whose work I've been following for a long time. And one of the great things about Cosmic Summit is even having already worked in circles where I had the benefit of being able to meet many of the Comet Research Group team members. I hadn't met Marc because, again, we're separated by the entire mass of the Earth on opposite ends of the globe. And thanks to George Howard and the Cosmic Summit, I finally got to meet Marc, and we've had some incredible conversations. Let me tell you about him. He's an Australian geoarchaeologist and key member of the Comet Research Group, recognized for his cutting-edge research into the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. He's got degrees, and of course, he has got incredible approaches to this topic that bridge geology and archaeology and the exploration of how ancient cosmic events have helped shape human history. Today, this is going to be a focus of the discussion he's going to be having with us about losing control of the past, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Please make welcome Marc Young.
Howdy everyone, how's it going? So today my presentation is called Losing Control of the Past, the Lost American Civilization and the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. For those who don't know me, I'm a former PhD candidate from Flinders University in South Australia and a member of the Comet Research Group. I first enrolled at university after seeing the Joe Rogan podcast with Randall and Graham back in 2017, and it's kind of cool to come full circle and meet the people who inspired me to go. So I'm going to start out by talking about the structure of scientific revolutions. The scientific method is supposed to be the foundational principle of science, within which everything claiming to be science is required to operate. This model has been described by legendary science author and philosopher Thomas Kuhn, and who posits three distinct paradigmatic environments that every scientist studying any particular discipline exists within. In other words, there are three stages or phases that every scientific truth ever established has gone through. These phases are normal science, crisis, and paradigm shift. Normal science is the routine work of scientists within an accepted framework or paradigm. A paradigm is a shared set of theories, methods, and assumptions that guide the research. During the normal science phase, scientists focus on solving specific problems within the paradigm's rules, like refining measurements, testing hypotheses. The body of research during this phase builds on existing knowledge, assuming the paradigm is correct. And when the vast majority of living scientists within that paradigm form a consensus, it ensures the research stability and better facilitates collaboration between larger groups. It's this paradigmatic environment that sets the stage for revolutions when anomalies that challenge the paradigm are discovered. A crisis emerges when anomalies, observations, or results that contradict the paradigm accumulate to such a degree that they cannot be resolved within its framework. This requires recognition of those anomalies, such as experiments that contradict predictions within the prevailing paradigm, undermining confidence in it. During a crisis, scientists are forced to question the paradigm's validity, leading to competing ideas and methodological disputes. The scientific community enters a state of instability, seeking new explanations. Crises expose the limitations of the current paradigm, creating conditions for a revolutionary shift. A paradigm shift occurs when a new paradigm replaces the old one, fundamentally changing how scientists understand and investigate the world. The new paradigm offers a novel worldview, often incompatible with the old, with different assumptions, methods, or theories. Older scientists may resist, but younger, more open-minded researchers embrace the new paradigm, leading to its dominance. The shift redefines scientific questions, methods, and interpretations, restarting the cycle by returning to the normal science phase within the new paradigm. The new paradigm is seen as the scientific truth of the day, regardless of how true it actually is. This cycle defines the entire history of science and occurred sometimes many times in every single field of inquiry that has had that has to date produced a scientific truth. Paradigm shifts resolve crises, enabling scientific progress but requiring a radical rethinking of established knowledge. However, archaeology as a discipline is inherently and fundamentally in a constant state of paradigmatic flux. Even the grandest narratives about the past are updated monthly with new discoveries, making it much more of an amorphous pool of knowledge than a coherent cycle, as any real science needs to experience. There isn't a coherent paradigm that everyone in the discipline agrees with. Archaeology today has been splintered into dozens of cells with an explicit set of socio-political principles that underpin it. Unlike science, archaeology is governed by theoretical paradigms, which lead to vastly different approaches to the same problem. While there have been many theoretical paradigms that have been adhered to in the past, the most dominant today are processualism and post-processualism. Unlike a scientific paradigm, where new understandings supersede the old ones and lead to a paradigmatic shift, theoretical paradigms run concurrently with each other, essentially dividing the discipline into two main camps. One result of this is that disagreements between each faction are rarely fully resolved. One faction approaches archaeology from a processual standpoint, while the other approaches it from a post-processual standpoint, with each camp claiming the other is incapable of arriving at the truth. While there have been many theoretical paradigms in archaeology's past, the most dominant today are processualism and post-processualism. Processualism emerged in the 1960s, where it was marketed as new archaeology. It emphasizes a scientific, objective study of the past, focusing on cultural processes and adaptation. Its key features include the following: hypotheses and testing, the use of systematic methods like statistical analyses to test theories about how societies evolved, a focus on systems, examination of environmental, economic, and social systems like subsistence strategies and trade networks, and objectivity. It seeks to understand laws of human behavior, minimizing subjective interpretation. Processualism quickly took the discipline by storm because it challenged cultural historical approaches and prioritized data over narrative. Post-processualism arose in the 1980s to the 1990s, after archaeological theorists had time to think about the implications of a strict reliance on statistical models and environmental data for interpreting the human past. As you can probably tell, post-processualism arose as a critique to processualism by many archaeologists within the discipline who emphasize the importance of subjective meaning, agency, and cultural context in the interpretation of the human past. Its key features include the following: interpretation over objectivity, highlighting individual actions and symbolic meanings in artifacts and sites. It recognizes diverse perspectives, e.g. gender, ethnicity, in interpreting the past. And it questions universal laws, favoring contextual and ideological analyses. It was developed in response to processualism's perceived limitations, integrating social theory and postmodern ideas into archaeology. Of course, the post-processualists are absolutely correct. The scientific method's ability to unravel the social, cultural, and political context of an artifact assemblage and the people who deposited it solely based on fragmented physical evidence within an entirely different social, cultural, and political context of the modern day is very limited. Post-processualists like Hodder, Shanks, and Tilley produced scathing critiques. Hodder's criticism of processualism compared it to the party in George Orwell's 1984 with the following quote and analysis: "The lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past," ran the party slogan, "controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. And statements about the past are about the unobservable, and they are unverifiable. Different pasts will be constructed within different but limited sets of social interest. The post-processualists know this is true, and this fact is what has splintered archaeology into the distinct socio-political disciplines across every intersection of society, like feminist archaeology, indigenous archaeology, migrant archaeology, conflict archaeology, and modern archaeology. And yes, there's even an entire archaeological theory devoted to debunking pseudo-archaeology. Of course, we all know who the leaders in that field are: pathological liars like Flint Dibble and John Hoops, hateful authoritarians who can't stand the idea that you believe something that their processualist paradigm has deemed as untrue. The post-processualists are correct. There are vast areas of humanity that cannot be manifested in the archaeological record. This is why I, as an archaeologist, consider archaeology to be a pseudoscientific discipline. The only true definition of pseudoscience, as its definition has been altered over the years by the party, is something other than science that masquerades as science. This definition fits perfectly with the discipline of archaeology as a whole, and in fact, a good percentage of the discipline explicitly agrees. Processual archaeologists claim to be scientists, but they're not, or in other words, they're masquerading as scientists. Despite the fact they're missing all of the subjective variables introduced when you add a human agent into the equation, these internet debunker archaeologists, whose ego relies on calling themselves scientists, can't stand the notion that a human should be allowed to believe whatever they like about the past. They have an authoritarian drive to control the narrative, and they have deep-held beliefs that science is infallible to the point that it should govern societal beliefs. Does this remind you of any particular German political party in the mid-1930s? Archaeologists have maintained tight control over the narrative of the human past for more than 75 years. However, their influence has been fading at unprecedented rates in the past 10 years. Flint Dibble, for example, is unironically proud of his performance in his debate against Graham Hancock. Sure, he got a few sound bites for his followers to sneer at, but when his claims throughout the debate began being fact-checked by various people like Dan and Sam, an illegitimate scholar, they soon fell apart. They and others quickly discovered massive errors, and when challenged on them, Flint put his immaturity and insincerity on full display by doubling and tripling down rather than admit he was wrong about it. For most people here, I won't need to explain too much about this one. It's the quintessential example Graham Hancock uses when he's discussing this topic. Decades ago, Jacques Cinq-Mars claimed that he discovered the earliest evidence of humans in the Americas at Bluefish Cave in the Yukon. He found animal bones that had clearly been modified by humans, but because they were twice as old as Clovis, about 24,000 years, he faced ridicule and career damage, dropping out of academia into a museum position. But one of the worst examples in the discipline that I never see talked about is the story of Louis Leakey and the Calico early man site in the California mountains. Louis Leakey was remarkably influential in archaeology in the 50s and 60s, along with his wife, the legendary paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey. He was a respected expert on very early human lithic technologies. He co-developed the earliest iterations of the out-of-Africa model of human evolution with his wife and their colleagues. Now, many of you will have heard of Mary Leakey, but I'm willing to bet almost none of you have heard about Louis. And that's because his career was destroyed, his name quietly scrubbed from archaeological history. In 1959, American archaeologist Ruth Simpson traveled to meet Louis during his expedition at Olduvai Gorge with Mary. Ruth informed him of an amazing discovery she'd made in the Calico Hills of California of a very old archaeological site with primitive tools that appeared to significantly predate Clovis. Leakey was an expert on the kind of crude stone tool technologies that our early ancestors were using in Africa, and these shared close similarities regarding their sophistication. When he first saw what Ruth Simpson had found at Calico, he instantly recognized that her artifacts were clearly stone tools made by humans and were clear evidence of human occupation. The problem was the finds were from very deep in the section below an alluvial fan that dated to at least 50,000 years ago. His name no doubt helped secure a significant grant for a few seasons of excavation at Calico, and he was astounded by what they were finding there. There was no doubt in his mind that this was a very ancient archaeological site that far predated Clovis. News of the find ripped through the archaeological community, and many lifelong Clovis First adherents, like Vance Haynes, visited the site and were unimpressed, to say the least. This led to significant pressure on Lewis over what he was claiming to have found, even though he wasn't alone. All of the archaeologists, anthropologists, lithic experts, museum curators in this list, and many more, agreed with him. All of those experts agreed unequivocally that the Calico artifacts were archaeological, aka human-made. Despite convincing many experts educated in the proper disciplines, not even the widely respected Leakey name was enough to save his career from the Clovis Mafia after they got wind of it. They likely began pressuring his wife Mary's funding organizations with her continuing Olduvai work, as she eventually disavowed her husband and tried to convince him to drop it. It's also likely that one of the Clovis Firsters even contacted the landowner and played up the value of the property's mining rights, which eventually ended the excavation. In the 60 years since the Calico fiasco, however, many more sites containing very similar lithic technologies that significantly predated Clovis have been found. In fact, what Louis Leakey had discovered was the first real trace of a lost civilization in the Americas. Now, the words lost civilization to this kind of crowd conjure up images of Atlantis or high-level technology, and this is what archaeologists like to argue against, both on the internet and in the pages of peer-reviewed journals. But this lithic technology was very simple, often requiring minimal working, with the goal of creating a good enough edge for the task at hand. They were very crude, and compared to a Clovis point, you could almost understand why the American archaeologists, who were spoiled by the extravagant workmanship of Clovis and post-Clovis points, were unwilling to accept they were man-made. Over the next few decades, archaeological investigations throughout the Americas began recovering crude stone tools that looked very similar to those Leakey was finding at Calico. At many of these sites, the tools were found in contact with other archaeological proxies, like high concentrations of animal bones, potential remains of cooking fires, etc. However, as with Calico and countless others since, critics would simply claim that the stone tools were geofacts made by natural processes, and some dogmatic zealots even claimed they were made by capuchin monkeys. That wasn't until the last couple of years. Now we have incontrovertible evidence that humans were living at the site of Santa Elina at least 25,000 years ago. Archaeologists there recovered bones of a giant sloth that had clear signs of drill holes and other evidence of human agency. Even better, they were able to directly date those bones to 27,000 years old. This closely aligns with the newly confirmed White Sands footprints at 24,000. Unfortunately for Vance Haynes and Stuart Fidel, these can't have been made by capuchin monkeys or natural processes. After more than a decade of work at the Chiquihuite site in Mexico, a group led by Cyprian Ardelian from Zacatecas University has published strong evidence of human occupation there as early as 33,000 years ago. And their lithics are some of the same as found at both Calico and the other South American sites. This find in Central America is the dot that connects the southern finds to the northern finds and demonstrates that these people, whoever they were, had dispersed through both continents at least 15,000 years before Clovis first appeared. Furthermore, in 2022, a team of South American archaeologists and geneticists discovered previously unknown extinct lineages dating back as early as 19,300 years ago. With this finding, we can say with confidence that the extinct lineages they discovered were likely the people who were inhabiting these Pleistocene archaeological sites. Perhaps the most interesting is the following quote from their paper. It is proposed that the population foci that existed 19.3 Ka in what is now Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and Brazil could have been drastically affected by the environmental episode that occurred during the Younger Dryas period. Q haplogroup Native American sublineages older than 12,900 years would have suffered a drastic decline in the Younger Dryas period, altering the ancient spatial structure of the human populations of the Americas and causing the extinction of lineages and loss as part of the gene pool. Recently, several YouTube archaeologists like David Miano and Professor Dave have attempted to paint the Clovis First doctrine as having been abandoned decades ago, claiming that no archaeologists worth their salt still abide by it today. For the most part, the discipline has indeed moved on from the paradigm, but its demise has left a paradigmatic vacuum, with no coherent paradigm coming forth to take its place. This is because the vicious nature of the debate over the previous decades has caused significant rifts between proponents of different theories. Most people know that Clovis First isn't tenable, but the true picture of the first people in the Americas has not emerged. However, there's still a dedicated faction of dogmatic archaeologists who refuse to let go of the Clovis First paradigm, even seeking to invent new analytical models to allow them to argue in favor of it. Essentially, the paradigm is shipwrecked at sea, and its former adherents are desperately clinging onto whatever debris they can find to stay afloat. All of these names here are archaeologists who still adhere to the Clovis First. Notable among them is Todd Sorrevell, whose early hatchet job against the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis set it back by more than a decade. Of course, he was fast-tracked to a professorship shortly after that for his efforts. Even though they will admit that Clovis First is dead, none of them are willing to admit that it was wrong to suppress the conflicting data throughout its reign. Other than Stuart Fidel, these archaeologists may not explicitly adhere to Clovis First, but the simple act of formulating these nitpicky arguments against this compelling evidence demonstrates that Clovis First is not dead. Despite its clear transition into the crisis phase, American archaeologists simply refuse to allow anything to replace it or to become the prevailing paradigm. One of the guys who campaigned hardest against Louis Leakey at Calico, 92-year-old Vance Haynes, is still campaigning against the same American lost civilization that Leakey discovered 60 years ago. But now let's talk about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and why it's so heavily resisted by paradigmatic holdouts. The Younger Dryas occurred between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. It was first discovered by Scandinavian paleobotanists in the 1890s in a Danish peat bog. They noticed a dramatic shift in the pollen record with a wildflower called Dryas octopetala that thrives in glacial conditions, making a resurgence. Later in the mid-1900s, this Younger Dryas, as it had come to be known, was discovered in many different fields of science, including paleoceanography, glaciology, and archaeology. It has quickly become the most intensively studied climatic anomaly throughout the last 2.5 million years of the Pleistocene, both because of how recently it occurred and the magnitude and pace of the changes that took place. The environmental changes at the YD onset, particularly atmospheric changes, took place in less than 1 year, as recorded in ice cores and lake valves, and temperatures in central Greenland plunged by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a few decades, a return to glacial temperatures that lasted more than 1,000 years. Then, at the end of the Younger Dryas, temperatures skyrocketed even more drastically within less than a decade, leading into the Holocene. One major event that's captivated scientists, including Charles Darwin himself for centuries, is the mass extinction of the Rancho La Brea or Ice Age megafauna. More than 50 genera of these megamammals went extinct either directly at or very close to the Younger Dryas onset. And over the years, many different hypotheses have been developed to explain why this might have occurred, including the overkill hypothesis, a long-standing pseudoscientific theory which is entirely dependent on another pseudoscientific assumption that humans arrived in the Americas at the exact time these mammals went extinct. As I've just shown you, it's now well established that people have been in the Americas for much longer than previously believed. And while many archaeologists now seek to distance themselves from the Clovis first debacle, they seem less willing to abandon the overkill hypothesis. The problem is that much of the support for overkill was derived from Clovis first. The two paradigms are codependent and tightly woven together. As you can see, the windows of last appearance of all megafaunal species in this graph overlap with the Younger Dryas onset. This means that statistically, all of these animals disappeared from the fossil records simultaneously. In 2007, a new theory was proposed that provided a single parsimonious explanation for all the aforementioned phenomena, wrapping it all up in a neat little package. They published evidence they'd been finding in the Younger Dryas boundary layer all over the United States that they believed were deposited by a major impact event, perhaps into the Laurentide ice sheet at the onset of the Younger Dryas. Over the 20 years of research, there's been over 150 peer-reviewed papers published that affirm the claims, and there's been about 75 that critique the claims. And they're all readable with a single click in the Younger Dryas bibliography. A central component of the hypothesis was the Younger Dryas black mat. This several-inch thick, usually black layer has been identified at more than 80 sites across North and South America, extending into Europe, and it marks the onset of the Younger Dryas. Contrary to common belief, the black component of the layer is not necessarily from charcoal or burning, but often instead from rotting vegetation, algae, and diatoms. If you picture a cold, damp wasteland in the aftermath of a major catastrophe, this is essentially what the black mat represents. The impact proxies published by the Firestone team are found in a very thin layer directly below the black mat, in direct contact with it, but not within it. Importantly, no remains of the Rancho La Brea megafauna or Clovis lithic technologies have ever been found above the black mat, only below it or within it. The black mat layer essentially marks the boundary between the old world, where humans were several rungs down the food chain, and the new world, where humans became the dominant species on the planet. The impact proxies they were finding included the following: melt products, melt glass, and lustre tellerite, high temperature magnetic microspherules, carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, glass-like carbon, and a recent discovery is shock-fractured quartz. Then in 2013, a large platinum spike was discovered in a Greenland ice core. This anomaly was soon replicated at the Younger Dryas boundary all over the world, from Chile, South Africa, Western Asia, and many sites in North America. It's now established that a platinum anomaly marks the Younger Dryas onset all over the world. This platinum signature serves as an archaeogeochemical datum, similar to how nuclear isotope concentrations are used as chronological datums for nuclear detonations. This allows us to overcome the limits of radiocarbon uncertainties and accurately pinpoint the Younger Dryas onset in any stratigraphic section containing it. This platinum is by far the most widespread Younger Dryas impact proxy yet discovered, and it's thought to indicate a significant airburst event due to how long it took to disperse out of the atmosphere. Here's a slightly outdated map showing the extent of the Younger Dryas boundary spherular layer. It's found at more than 100 sites spanning 5 continents, and it points to localized impacts at many different sites. And some sites, like in South Africa there, Only the platinum has been found so far. As you can probably imagine, such a disruptive theory has not been well received, and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has suffered many setbacks over the last 2 decades, almost exclusively stemming from poor methodologies when attempting to reproduce the results. See my Cosmic Summit 2023 presentation and my article on Graham Hancock's website for an in-depth review of these issues and the Younger Dryas' history. In 2020, Sun et al. Published a paper in the prestigious journal Science Advances. They claimed to have determined that the Younger Dryas boundary at Hall's Cave in Texas was formed by a volcanic eruption rather than a cosmic impact, as YDIH proponents believe. Shortly after it was published, Dr. Martin Sweatman examined the paper in detail and found significant flaws with their methodology. He published a YouTube video exposing the deep methodological issues with the paper, which I'm not even going to get into here because they're unimportant compared to what we later discovered. Dr. Thomas Stafford Jr., a leading expert in radiocarbon dating and the early peopling of the Americas, reached out to Dr. Sweatman after seeing his video. He agreed with his assessment of their shoddy methods and provided a much greater context into the issue. As it turned out, Dr. Stafford was the principal investigator of Hall's Cave and was originally a co-author on Sun et al. 2020. However, the other authors ignored his deep concerns with the paper and rushed to submit it to the journal. Stafford had to contact the journal and make a formal request to remove his name from the paper, but because he was involved in every step of writing the manuscript, he had copies of the original data and all of the draft stages that the manuscript went through. Stafford then provided these copies to both Martin and myself, and what they revealed to us was absolutely shocking. Now you can see in the yellow column there, these are the depths of samples they collected. So all the way down, there's a consistent 1 to 2 centimeter gap between each sample until you reach the area in the blue square there, where there's a 4 centimeter gap. And I found that quite interesting because after the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was first published in 2007, Dr. Stafford was very interested in testing its claims and invited the Firestone team to come and work on the very well-preserved sedimentary sequence in Hall's Cave. And what they found there was amazing. He worked with Alan West, Jim and Doug Kennett, and Wendy Wolbach to search for impact proxies in the Younger Dryas boundary, and they certainly found them. In the Younger Dryas boundary sediment between 151 to 153 centimeters depth, they found nanodiamonds, magnetic microspherules, and carbon spherules. But hang on, what was that depth again? Was it 153 centimeters? Isn't that the layer that was missing from Sun et al.'s data set? Stafford's original data revealed the reason why Sun et al. Had not published their sample from 153 centimeters. It just so happened to contain a gigantic platinum anomaly, more than 10 times background, the highest concentration in the entire cave. In other words, the sample from 153 contains the global Younger Dryas boundary platinum anomaly, confirmed in the YDB at more than a dozen sites spanning 5 continents. If Sun et al. Had not omitted this sample from their final manuscript, they would have been forced to admit that the Younger Dryas boundary occurred at 153 in their section. The problem is, admitting that would have completely invalidated all the major claims they make in their paper. Instead, their Younger Dryas boundary occurs 2 centimeters above the real YDB at 151 centimeters, and they wanted so badly to claim the volcanic signature they found in that layer was what caused the Younger Dryas. Sun et al. Had clearly set out with a predetermined goal of discrediting the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and they were willing to resort to explicit scientific fraud to achieve that goal. Now, the CRG has had a bad time over the last 5-10 years. Currently, we have multiple papers under review in traditional peer-reviewed journals, and there's evidence of suppression and tampering with the peer review process. One paper that had previously passed reviews and been accepted for publication, but then it was sent back for a second round of reviews. Another paper was reviewed by 7 different people and now sits in limbo. The editor has ignored repeated inquiries from us as to the paper's status. When I first discovered the fraud that Sunnydale had perpetrated against the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, I was shaken to my core. How could supposedly reputable scientists get away with publishing unequivocal fraud like that? I was overwhelmed with righteous fury, and I knew I had to expose this fraud to the world. I set about contacting the authors and tried to catch them in a lie. I played dumb. I asked them general questions about whether they took samples from that layer and what they found. They responded by CCing my PhD supervisor in their reply, claiming that I was threatening them, and he called me into his office for a chat. I spent more than 3 hours discussing the issue with my supervisor, and he was shocked by what he was seeing. He agreed with me that this was particularly egregious fraud, but he cautioned me against going public with it. Now, don't get me wrong, his advice was in good faith. I was just a PhD student, and taking on such esteemed scientists, tenured professors, and well-respected experts in their field was going to be bad for my career. I was also in the middle of a PhD, and I should have been focusing on that instead of what I discovered. He was correct, of course, and I backed down, but what I didn't realize at the time was that compromising my integrity in such a way would have a significant impact on my mental health. I'd been working with my supervisor on various projects for the last 5 years, and I had nothing but respect for him. But when he essentially advised me to cover up scientific fraud that I cared so deeply about, that respect began to fade. I gradually became disinterested with the PhD, and I had significant trouble engaging in the work. This caused me to fall behind, and I was left with no choice but to withdraw from the program and abandon my life's goals. Shortly before withdrawing, I submitted ethics inquiries to each of the authors' universities and wrote to the editors of Science Advances and the editor-in-chief of the science portfolio, Holden Thorpe, seeking a retraction. I provided a detailed summary of the issues with the paper, copies of the original data, and every draft stage of the manuscript. You could look through those draft stages and pinpoint the exact point at which the fraud occurred. Long story short, Holden Thorpe refused to retract the paper, claiming that an independent investigator had found no wrongdoing, despite the evidence being abundant and clear. As it turns out, Holden has a bit of a shady history himself. He was run out of University of North Carolina in 2008 after he was discovered overseeing an academic fraud ring involving college athletes. And because he never ratted out his co-conspirators, he was awarded with prestigious positions elsewhere, eventually being handed full control of arguably the most prestigious science journal in the world. The corrupt reward the corrupt, and outright scientific fraud is protected, as long as it protects the prevailing paradigm. Of course, new ideas with good evidence to support them that do challenge the prevailing paradigm must be destroyed. Here are 3 examples of politically motivated retractions against ostensibly reasonable and well-evidenced claims that challenge the party's narrative. Dr. Ken Tankersley's Ohio airburst paper was retracted solely because he used a well-accepted method called stratigraphic correlation to connect 2 Hopewell occupation layers in different areas. Dr. Nadawajaja's Gunung Padang paper was retracted solely because his dating was obtained from soil organics rather than directly from artifacts or charcoals. Applying such rigid standards would see hundreds of other archaeological papers retracted too. Of course, the real reason it was retracted is because Dr. Nadawajaja's association with Graham Hancock. Dr. Bunch's Tal el-Hammam paper was retracted after 5 years of back-and-forth arguments, not a single one addressing the actual physical evidence that an airburst destroyed the city. A few years ago, it became clear that the CRG was blacklisted in most reputable journals. all due to influential critics spreading lies and disinformation about our work to editors behind the scenes. The retracted papers on the Hopewell airburst and the Tal el-Hammam airburst have both been updated and republished in the CRG's new journal, Airburst and Cratering Impacts. This journal is a powerful tool against censorship, and the CRG greatly appreciates any and all support from the community. It allows us to keep up the fight and keep producing hard data concerning the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the cataclysm that changed the trajectory of humanity forever. The YDIH has slowly but steadily been gaining supporters in the scientific community, especially in the last 10 years, as most of the early critical studies have been revealed as shallow hatchet jobs, using methods that aren't capable of replicating the original claims, misrepresenting samples, or even deleting inconvenient data from their manuscript, like Sinodal. It's a science-based hypothesis that disrupts the paradigm vacuum in American archaeology, which alone is enough to piss off an authoritarian control freak. But it's also used as a major crutch for a bunch of alternative theories that are seeking to hitch their wagons to it and sneak through the door with it when it's eventually accepted as the new prevailing paradigm. So what's new in Younger Dryas boundary research? More than a decade ago, Robert Fitzenreiter, a private citizen from Louisiana, reached out to the Comet Research Group, claiming that the property he inherited from his father had some very anomalous materials around the place that he thought might be from an impact event. At the time, the CRG didn't have the time or the resources to pursue the matter with any great urgency, so nothing much ended up happening until after the CRG received generous donations from a couple of philanthropists in the early 2020s. Upon revisiting the project and taking some samples around the place, it quickly became clear that Robert was absolutely correct. High concentrations of melt products were centered around the small seasonal lake on the property, which was likely formed by the superheated plume of plasma that was projected to the ground after the low altitude detonation of a comet fragment. Samples were taken from all of the locations marked with yellow circles in the right-hand image. Something had certainly touched down on his property, all right, but when did it happen? Over the last couple of years, the CRG has been dabbling in hydrocode modeling. Using the engineering software Autodyne, we've been producing computer simulations of potential airburst scenarios that could be capable of explaining what we see on the ground at the sites we've been working on, including at Tal el-Hammam in Jordan. I've personally contributed to some of those other models, but I wasn't involved in this one for Perkins. But now let me show you what kind of things the CRG was finding on Robert Fitzenreiter's property. There were incredible deposits of melt glass, huge slabs of melted sediment with large numbers of spherules embedded in them. Alan West and the team had never seen such incredible deposits and quickly realized this place was special. Just look at the amazing concentrations of spherules in these glasses. Not only were there high concentrations of magnetic microspherules, there were huge numbers of carbon spherules formed by droplets of melted or boiled tree resin, such as copal and other plant materials, and burned wood as well. Burned biomass, I guess. The internal structures of these spherules, shown on the left here, suggest they were melted and cooled in a very short time by some kind of transient high-temperature event. On the left here are selected samples of trinitite collected from the site. Trinitite was first discovered after the Trinity atomic bomb test, when investigators came in to survey the destruction it had caused. They found large swaths of desert sand had been melted into green-colored sheets of glass. On the right, we have an incredible selection of copal or resin spherules, photographed using both optical and scanning electron microscopes. Since I presented at Cosmic Summit in 2023, the CRG have been hard at work publishing a new line of evidence that we strongly believe was formed during an impact event: shock-fractured quartz. We call it this to distinguish it from traditional shock quartz, as while there are many similarities between them, shock-fractured quartz does not meet all the criteria required to be considered traditional shock quartz. On the left is an image of traditionally shocked quartz. It was found in the Younger Dryas boundary layer in Europe by Van Hosel et al. Unfortunately, Van Hosel chose to interpret the presence of this grain in that layer as indicative that a shocked quartz grain from a different, much older impact must have found its way into the Younger Dryas boundary there. Yes, you heard that right. This is the kind of dumbassery that has plagued the YDIH since its inception. Anyway, traditional shocked quartz grains are formed during cratering impacts, where the object from space makes it through the atmosphere intact and disperses its energy through the Earth's crust. However, airbursts occur when the object detonates and disperses energy through the atmosphere instead, subjecting any rocks or sediment it contacts to lower pressures than are produced during an impact. This shock fractured quartz was first published by the CRG in 2021 from Tal El Hammam, actually, with a later 2023 paper laying out the theoretical framework for how they're formed. In that 2023 paper, the CRG showed that these shock fractures can be formed in grains of sediment during both nuclear and cosmic airbursts, such as the Trinity explosion, Tunguska, and at Tal El Hammam. They share many similarities with traditional shock quartz, but the key indicator they were formed by an impact event is that the fractures contain amorphous silica, or quartz glass. Realistically, silica glass can only be formed in nature by a couple of processes, one being during a high-temperature, high-pressure event, like an airburst or an impact, and the other being the process that makes opals deep underground. However, silica glass formed by high-temperature, high-pressure events differs chemically from opal glass, which is well hydrated. These shock-fractured quartz grains have been found in nearly every Younger Dryas boundary deposit we've looked for them since the CRG first introduced them as a new proxy. One of my first projects with the CRG was searching thin sections under the microscope to identify candidates for further investigation. This part of the process is very time intensive, and I was more than happy to donate my time and make use of the microscopy lab in the archaeology department at Flinders, so that Alan and others could focus their time on more pressing issues. Once a candidate is confirmed, we use almost a dozen different analytical methods on every single sample to rule out any alternative formation processes. These include 3 types of optical microscopy: scanning electron microscopy, electron backscatter diffraction, cathodoluminescence, and Raman spectroscopy. And Perkins was no different. These images show shock-fractured quartz grains recovered from Perkins, where it is in high abundance. On the right-hand image, the pinky red micrographs were taken using cathodoluminescence. The blue colors inside the fractures indicate the presence of silica glass. Traditional shock quartz is characterized by distinct planar deformation features that strictly adhere to the crystal lattices and are perfectly parallel. And while some YDB shock grains do exhibit classic PDFs, in most grains these fractures are planar, but not so strictly parallel. Of course, while the CRG were absolutely confident that these grains were fractured during airburst events and have done extensive work to back up their claims, the fact that these grains differ from traditional shock quartz is enough for them to be dismissed by leading impact experts. What are their arguments for why they don't support an impact event? Well, simply because they're different, of course. There's been no criticism yet published that seeks to counter the arguments the CRG is making. The impact mafia just dismisses us out of hand. The reason they need to do this is because they know that we're correct. Dr. Ted Bunch, who passed away a couple of years ago, was a pioneer in shock quartz research at Meteor Crater in Arizona. In fact, his PhD was centered on developing the physical and chemical criteria to diagnose shocked quartz. He literally helped develop the diagnostic criteria for shocked quartz. This guy knows shocked quartz when he sees it. He was a world-renowned expert in impact geology and a former NASA section chief. But then he made the mistake of joining the Firestone team and becoming a key member of the CRG after its formation. Now he's joined the long list of paradigmatic martyrs like Louis Leakey, Jacques Cinq-Mars, and J. Harlan Bretz. Most recently, a team of independent Russian scientists have been working on Younger Dryas age deposits throughout the Baltic region. A year or so ago, they published a paper detailing their work at one site, where they reported finding enormous magnetic microspherules in dark soil horizons that dated to the YDB. It seems that after this discovery, they did quite a bit of reading about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and came to realize that what they were seeing throughout the Baltic was an extension of the black mat layer, first described throughout North America. Their latest contribution adds 12 new black mat sites in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, extending the reach of the YD black mat by tens of thousands of square miles. And that's all I've got for you guys. Thank you. Yeah, let's do some questions, yeah. Yep. I can't recall if some of we have shock quartz from Trinity, but there are other detonations where we did find it. There was a couple of Russian ones. I think Malcolm might know if that includes Trinity. It does? Gunter? Yep, it does, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Sal-Bomba, and yeah, there's all sorts of nuclear detonations that have formed this material that we're seeing now and attributing to airburst events. Exactly, yep. Anyone else? Oh, yep, hi. Are you asking if there's a conspiracy out there to suppress the research? Yeah. Now, I don't think there's secret roundtable groups meeting every weekend to talk about how they're going to attack our theory this week, but certainly people like Flint Dibble, John Hoops, Carl Fegans, all the internet debunkers, I'm pretty confident they have some sort of group chat where they... I know they do. There's a page on Facebook called Forbidden Archaeology Wall of Shame or something. And it has like 100,000 members, and the sole purpose of that group is to post things that people are posting on social media and ridicule them. So there's certainly some sort of content aggregate where they all see the same thing and they can coordinate their attacks on people. So yeah, I'd say there's no explicit conspiracy, but there is some kind of soft conspiracy, or at least standalone complex. Yeah. Hi, Gunter. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so Gunter's name appearing on a blacklist with other CRG authors has led to his papers getting extra scrutiny when they're nothing to do with the Younger Dryas stuff. So, hi Joanne, how's it going?
It's going well. So, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And so do you want to mention what happened with us with that Facebook group and how...
Not really worth it. No, I mean,
we have a group where people want to discuss.
yeah. That was actually a different group. It was Friends of the Pleistocene we got blacklisted from, and then just for discussing the Younger Dryas impact papers. And then a few members from that group formed a new Facebook group called ET Impact Arguments No Holds Barred or something. So, yeah, because there are some people out there who want to foster debate rather than just shut down the narrative. And I give those people a lot of credit. So. How's that? Yeah. Yep. Exactly. That's why the arrow pointed halfway between crisis and paradigm shift, because we're in the process. Well, that's the whole idea of a crisis. It's the minority of people who point out issues. Absolutely, I agree with that. If I'm shown that I'm wrong, then I'll accept it. Simple as that. I haven't been shown that. That's because they're operating within the normal paradigm of science. So obviously they're going to assume that they're correct. Exactly, and we'll be assuming that we're correct. But that doesn't mean we are. Like I said before, just because something is a scientific truth, that doesn't mean it's an actual truth. It just means that it hasn't been refuted yet. I didn't say that. I said a few people in a sub-discipline of archaeology are attributed, similar to Nazis, yeah, in their ideology, yeah. So if you want to generalize what I've said, when I've been very specific with who I'm targeting with that statement, then you're just being disingenuous. Did you just come here to disrupt, or? Okay. Well, you've attributed several things to me that I didn't say. I accept that, yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir, at the back. With water what, sorry? Yeah, water impacts, yeah. So obviously an impact into the water is going to significantly reduce, the pressure's being dispersed through the water, right? So it's much more capable than rock at dispersing that. I would think that it's more proficient than air as well, because the thicker the medium, while it's still, I guess, an impact into land liquefies the rock temporarily as well. There certainly would be different proxies. For example, Burkle Crater that Dr. Dallas Abbott's and others have worked on in the past. Some of these impacts do leave craters on the bottom of the ocean, depending on their size and speed and trajectory and all that. And an impact into oceanic sediment, assuming that it doesn't completely excavate all the water and leave it exposed to air for a short time, the impactites would be more hydrated. And that's one of the things they found at Hiawatha Crater. The impactites had high water content, which suggested to those scientists that the impact had occurred into the ice rather than just the land. So there are ways to tell the difference between oceanic impact proxies and land impact proxies. And I guess they would be generally similar in form, but there would certainly be differences. I don't know if that answered your question. Or at the very least, you lose the potential to disperse them over large areas, right? So if they were formed, they'd be instantly recovered with water and disperse on the bottom of the ocean. Yeah. So one of the things that Dallas Abbott's found with the Burkle crater is that the mega tsunami chevrons she attributes to it, they have impact ejecta fused with benthic foraminifera from the bottom of the ocean. So that's one way, the contents of the impactites are one way to diagnose an oceanic impact. Yeah. That's one of the papers that's being suppressed at the moment. We've been working on ocean cores from Baffin Bay in Greenland, and there's high concentrations of cometary dust in those cores at the Younger Dryas onset. Yeah. Exactly, yep. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Malcolm. All good. Do you want to...